There is a bridge in Edinburgh that most people cross without ever seeing it. It is called the South Bridge, and when it was finished in the last years of the 18th century, it was a marvel of the practical sort. It carried a road over a steep valley so smoothly that a traveller might walk its whole length and never understand he was on a bridge at all. Shops rose along both sides and pressed in against the parapets until the drop beneath them disappeared from view. From the street, it was simply another street. Only from below, down in the valley it crossed, could a person look up and see the great arches holding the city over empty air. There were 19 of those arches, and because the builders of that century did not care to waste good enclosed space, they did what builders had always done. They filled the hollows inside the bridge with rooms. Chambers were let to the tradesmen of the street above. A cobbler kept his lasts and leather down there. A cooper stacked his barrels. Merchants stored what merchants store in the dark, out of the rain, close to their shops and cheap to rent. For a little while the underside of the bridge was a working place, ordinary and dull, lit by lamps and busy with the small industry of the town. It did not last. The trouble was water, as it so often is. The stone of the bridge had been raised quickly, and it had not been sealed against the weather the way a cellar is sealed. Rain came down through the roadway above, found the joints in the masonry, and made its slow way into the chambers below. The rooms began to weep. Damp rose in the walls and stood in the corners and would not be driven out. Leather rotted. Barrels swelled and stained. The goods that men had stored in the dry dark came up spoiled, and one by one the tradesmen gave up their chambers and carried their trade back into the daylight and did not return. Within a generation of its building, the inside of the bridge had been abandoned by the people who had a choice. But a city is never short of people who have no choice. Edinburgh, in those years, was one of the most crowded places in Europe. The old town was a warren of tall stone tenements packed along a single ridge, and into that ridge were pressed more human beings than the ridge could reasonably hold. There were the respectable poor and the desperate poor, and below even them, the people the record does not name at all. The ones who came to a great city because a great city is the last place that will take you in. For them, a dry corner was worth having, and a corner out of the wind was worth more. And here, beneath the bridge, out of the rain and out of the sight of anyone who would move them along, was a whole warren of empty rooms that no one wanted and no one watched. So they went down into the bridge, and they lived there. We do not have their names. That is the first thing to understand about the vaults, and it is the hardest, because a story wants names, and the record does not have them to give. The people who sheltered under the South Bridge kept no ledgers and left no letters. What we have instead is the shape of the place they lived in, and from the shape we can read a little of the life. We know the chambers were windowless because they were inside a bridge, and a bridge has no windows. We know they had no drains and no clean water because none had been built. We know that the only light was whatever a person carried in, a candle, a rushlight, the red mouth of a small fire, and that when that light went out, the dark down there was total, the particular dark of a place the sun has never once reached. Think of that only as long as it helps you drift, and then let it go. A room with no window and no morning. A whole quiet community of the poorest people in a rich city living in the bones of a bridge beneath the boots of everyone who crossed it. Above them, the shops. Above the shops, the road. Above the road, the weather they had gone down there to escape. And none of the thousands who crossed the South Bridge each day on their way to church or market or the comfortable business of their lives had any particular reason to know that below the cobbles the city had a cellar, and that the cellar was full of people. In time, even they left, or died, or were cleared, and the vaults were forgotten so completely that the city above lost the memory of the rooms entirely. The entrances were built up, the chambers filled with rubble and with the rubbish that a century pours into any hole it can find. And for the better part of 150 years, the inside of the South Bridge was simply solid, as far as anyone knew. A bridge like any other, with nothing beneath the road but more stone. They were found again by accident in the latter part of the 20th century, when the rubble was cleared and the chambers opened to the air for the first time in living memory. People went down with lamps, as people always had, and found the rooms much as the last of the poor had left them, minus everything soft enough to rot away, bare stone, the marks of old fires, the slow, permanent damp still standing in the corners, patient as it had always been. No one who went down expected very much. It was a bridge, after all, and bridges are not usually thought to have insides worth exploring. What they found instead was a small, forgotten neighborhood, complete and undisturbed in its own dark way, exactly where the map said there should have been nothing at all but solid stone. It is a strange thing to be wrong about the inside of a building you have walked over your whole life, and the city was wrong about the South Bridge for the better part of a century and a half before anyone thought to go and check. And here, where the history thins out, the other kind of story begins. The kind I always mark clearly so you know which is which. The reopened vaults became a place that people visit in the dark, and people who visit dark places in the dark bring their fear down with them, and sometimes believe they have found it waiting there. There are tales told of these chambers now, of a presence in one particular vault that does not care to be disturbed, of the feeling, common enough underground, that the darkness ahead of your lamp is not quite empty. I set those tales beside the history, and I do not pretend they are the same thing. The history is the true and heavier weight, and the history is this, that a great and elegant city built itself a hidden room and filled it for a while with the people it would rather not have seen. The dark under the bridge was real. It did not need a ghost. It had the poor, and it had the cold, and it had the particular silence of a place that the world has agreed to forget. The fire is holding. Let the vaults close behind us now. We are going to come up out of the bridge and go a little way along the ridge to a street that suffered the opposite fate, a street that was not abandoned and emptied, but sealed with its life still in it. Not every part of the old city was abandoned to the dark. Some of it was simply built over while it was still living. And that is a stranger thing to picture than an empty vault, because it means the roof going up over your head was somebody else's floor. The old town of Edinburgh grew the only way it could, which was upward and downward at once. The ridge it stood on was narrow, hemmed in by a loch on one side and by the crown's boundary on the other, so when the city needed more room, it did not spread outward. It stacked. Between the main street and the slope fell a series of narrow lanes, closes, each one a corridor of tenements pressed shoulder to shoulder, 6 and 7 stories in places, with a single entrance from the street above called the close mouth. A close was not a ruin and not a slum by design. It was simply how a crowded ridge housed itself, shopkeepers and merchants and their families, going about the ordinary business of a life, up and down the same worn stone stair for a generation or 3. One of those closes carried the name of a woman called Mary King, a burgess and merchant of the city in the early 1600s, and for a long while it was exactly what its neighbors were: homes, workshops, a change house or two where a traveler might buy a drink and a bed. Nothing in its early record marks it as different from a dozen closes like it. In 1644, plague reached the close, as it reached most of the old town sooner or later, and by the time it had run its course the following year, something in the region of 600 people in and around that street had died, perhaps as much as half of everyone who lived there. That is the true weight of it, and it is heavy enough. But a heavier story than the true one has grown up around this close in particular, and I want to set it right before we go on, because it is exactly the kind of story I am careful about. The tale, as it is often told now, holds that the city sealed the close while the plague was still inside it, bricking up doors and windows with the sick and the dying still behind them, abandoning whole families to die alone in the dark, rather than risk the disease spreading further. It is a vivid image, and it is not what the record shows. What the record shows is closer to the opposite. The town council of the time ran what was, for its century, a genuinely careful response. Those who were well enough to travel were moved out of the close entirely, to open ground beyond the town called the Burg Muir, away from the crowding that let plague spread. Those too sick to be moved were not walled in and forgotten. They were asked to hang a white cloth from their window, a signal to the men appointed to walk the close each day, so that food and coal could be left at their door without anyone needing to enter and risk the sickness themselves. It was not a kind century by our standards, and I do not want to make it sound gentler than it was. But it was not the story of a street sealed shut over the living either. The close was not even emptied for good afterward. People went on living in Mary King's Close ordinarily for another 2.5 centuries until the very last resident finally left it in 1902. I tell you the correction because it matters to me that the frightening things I bring you are the true ones, not the invented ones dressed up to frighten you harder. 600 real deaths, and a council that tried, however imperfectly, to care for the dying rather than abandon them, is already a heavier thing to carry into sleep than a myth about bricked-up doors. Let the myth go. Keep the 600. What made Mary King's Close different from most of its plague-struck neighbors was not the plague at all. It was what happened to the ridge above it more than a century later. In the 1750s, the city decided to build itself a new Royal Exchange, a grand covered building for its merchants to trade in, and the site chosen for it sat directly across the top of several of the old closes, Mary King's among them. Rather than clear the closes away entirely, the builders did something more practical and considerably stranger. They took the lower stories of the standing buildings, foundations that were already sound, and built the new exchange on top of them, using the old walls as the base for the new ones. The upper stories of the close were taken down. What remained beneath, the ground floors and cellars, the close mouth, and the lower flights of the old stair, were sealed in and left standing because it was cheaper to build over solid stone than to dig it out. So the street did not fall into ruin. It was simply capped mid-life, and the city carried on walking over its own roof without a thought for what was holding it up. For the greater part of 2 centuries, that is precisely what happened. The exchange became the city chambers. Generations of clerks and councillors crossed the courtyard above, and beneath their feet the old close sat in the dark, exactly as it had been left, walls standing, doorways in place, waiting for nobody in particular. It has since been opened again, carefully, and can be walked through much as it was, and that is where the second kind of story begins, the kind I set apart from the first. In recent years, a tale has grown up around one room in the close, concerning a child called Annie. The story, as it is told now, holds that a visitor with no prior knowledge of the close once sensed a small, distressed presence there, and was told her name was Annie, and that she had lost her family and her doll. Since that telling, visitors have left small toys and dolls in that room by the hundred, a gesture of kindness toward a story rather than evidence of a fact. I want to be precise about this, because the close itself is precise about it. There is no historical record of a child named Annie dying there, and the attraction that preserves the close today presents the tale exactly as I have given it to you, as something told in recent memory, not something written in an old parish register. It is a kind gesture built on an unproven claim, and both of those things can be true together. The toys are real. The kindness is real. Annie, as a documented person, is not. What is documented, and what I would rather you carry with you as you drift, is the plainer fact underneath the story, A whole street of ordinary lives, shops and homes and stairs worn smooth by foot traffic, was quietly built over by the city it belonged to, and kept there, intact in the dark, while the world above it went on trading and arguing and building its grand new hall without a backward glance. You do not need a ghost for that to unsettle you gently into sleep. You only need to picture your own street, capped over and left standing, waiting in the quiet for someone, anyone, to come back down and remember it was there. The fire is still low and steady. We will leave the close sealed behind us and climb the ridge a little further, to a quieter green space that has held Edinburgh's dead for 400 years, and once, for a single hard winter, held some of its living as well. Greyfriars Ars sits where the old town begins to loosen into open ground, a walled kirkyard that has taken in the city's burial since the later part of the 1500s. It is, in the plainest sense, exactly what it looks like. Rows of stone, old and new, leaning together, moss thickening in the lettering of names that were once important to somebody. Most kirkyards are only that, a long, patient list of the dead, and Greyfriars Ars would be no different if two things had not happened within its walls that had nothing to do with burial at all. The first was in the winter of 1638, when a great many people gathered in the kirkyard to put their names, or their mark, to a document called the National Covenant. It was a statement of resistance, signed by ministers and nobles and ordinary parishioners together, against changes the Crown wished to impose on how the Church in Scotland was to be governed, and how it was to worship. Those who signed it, and those who came to be identified with its cause in the decades that followed, were known as Cove Nanterts, and the name would go on to carry a heavy cost for many of them. Whatever you think of the theology, and I do not intend to explain it to you at this hour, the plain fact is this: thousands of people stood in this ground and put their name to a belief they were prepared to be punished for, and many of them were. The second thing happened 41 years later, and it is the harder of the two to sit with. In 1679, after a rising by Covenanter forces was put down at a place called Bothwell Brig, a great number of the defeated men were marched to Edinburgh as prisoners. There was nowhere built to properly hold so many at once, so a portion of Greyfriars Ars kirkyard, this same burial ground, was fenced off and used as an open enclosure to keep them. Through that winter, with little shelter and little mercy shown, the prisoners were held there among the graves of the city's dead, waiting on trials and transportations, and worse, that many of them did not survive to see. I will not dress that up for you. It was a cold field with a wall around it, and inside the wall were men who had signed a paper and were now paying for the signature with the season itself. Set those two things side by side. A ground where people came freely to declare what they believed, and the same ground used, within living memory of the first event, to punish some of those very believers for having done exactly that. History rarely arranges its ironies so neatly, but this one it did. I will follow those men a little further than the Kirkyard wall, because most accounts of Greyfriars leave them exactly there in the winter enclosure, as though the story simply stopped. It did not stop. Of the prisoners who survived that season, 257 were eventually sentenced to transportation, to be shipped out to the colonies and sold into a term of indentured labor there. In November of that same year, they were marched to the docks at Leith and put aboard a ship called the Crown of London, held below in a space so cramped that men are recorded to have fainted for want of air, fed and watered only barely, for the better part of a fortnight before the ship finally sailed. It did not get far. 10 days out, in a storm off the coast of Orkney, the Crown of London struck rock at a headland called Deerness and began to break apart. Most of the prisoners were still shut below decks when it went down, and the crew, by most accounts, made little effort to free them. One sailor is remembered for taking an axe to the hatch on his own initiative, and by his effort alone, some 47 men escaped the wreck alive. The rest, more than 200 of them, drowned within sight of a shore they never reached, having survived a battle, a winter in a fenced graveyard, and a fortnight in a ship's hold, only to be lost in the last few hundred yards of the whole ordeal. A stone stands on that headland now, raised more than 2 centuries later, looking out over the water where it happened, and it is, as far as I am concerned, as much a part of this Kirkyard story as anything carved into the stone at Greyfriars itself, even though the sea is a very long way from here. There is a third thing associated with Greyfriars now, and I set it apart clearly, the way I did with the close. In one corner of the Kirkyard stands the mausoleum of a man named George Mackenzie, a lawyer of the same period who, among his other work, prosecuted a number of the Cayuvunanters held in that enclosure. In recent decades, visitors and tour groups have reported disturbances centered on and around his tomb. Scratches, faintness, sudden cold, the kind of account that gathers around any confined stone building at night with enough footsteps passing through it. It is told and retold as a modern haunting, and I record it as exactly that, a reported and much repeated tale, not a documented event, and certainly not history in the sense that the Covenant and the winter enclosure are history. The lawyer's tomb makes a fitting shape for a story to gather round, given who is buried there and who was held nearby. But a fitting shape is not the same thing as a fact, and I am careful, always, to keep the two apart for you. Let the Kirkyard settle back into stillness now. We are going to leave the dead for a while and go looking for a man who was very much alive, respected, trusted, and seen every day on the street, who happened also to be someone else entirely once the shutters came down. There is a tavern on the Lawn Market today that carries a man's name and his face on the sign, and most who drink there know only the outline of why. The full shape of it is worth more than a sign. William Brodie was born into respectability and never once, in the eyes of his neighbours, left it. His father was a cabinet maker of good standing, and William inherited both the trade and the position that came with it, a skilled maker of fine furniture and locks, a member of the Trades Incorporation, and in time a deacon, an elected office with a seat on the town council itself. He paid his way. He dressed well. He was, by every account his fellow citizens could have given at the time, exactly the sort of man Edinburgh trusted to help run itself. He was also, for the better part of 2 decades, the head of a gang of burglars, and he ran that second trade with the same patience he brought to the first. The work he did by day gave him the perfect instrument for the work he did by night. As a locksmith and cabinet maker, Brodie was called into the finest homes and shops in the city to fit and repair locks. And while his hands did the honest work, his eyes did the other kind, noting the turn of a mechanism, the weight of a key, the position of a window latch. He kept wax and made impressions where he could, or simply remembered what he had seen well enough to cut a second key later, alone, in his own workshop. By night, in plain clothes and a soft hat, he let himself into the premises his daylight self had been paid to secure, and took what could be carried and sold. He recruited others to help him carry it, and paid them from the proceeds. And by every account, he was as careful and controlled in the second trade as he was respected in the first. Neither side of his life, for many years, so much as glimpsed the other. It could not last, and eventually it did not. A robbery at the General Excise Office in the March of 1788 went wrong when an official of the office, returning unexpectedly in the evening, disturbed the gang mid-theft, and in the scramble that followed, one of Brodie's own accomplices, arrested and facing the noose himself, gave evidence against him to save his own neck, in the same manner Hare would later save his own, though this happened 40 years before Hare did it. Brodie fled the city, then the country, and was eventually traced to Amsterdam and brought back to Edinburgh to stand trial before the very court and city he had, until recently, helped to govern. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang, alongside one of his own gang, and on the 1st of October that same year, he was executed at the old toll booth on the High Street, in front of a crowd the record puts at some 40,000 people. A fair portion of the city's whole population turned out to watch. Among them, by most accounts, stood his own daughter, not yet 11 years old. That much is settled record, and it is heavy enough on its own. There is one further piece, and I give it to you exactly as it comes down to us, as a tale, not as history. It is said that Brodie, no stranger to preparing for an escape, wore a steel collar and a length of silver tube beneath his shirt to keep his neck from breaking cleanly, and had arranged, or believed he had arranged, for his body to be cut down quickly and revived once the crowd had gone. Whether any of that is true, no record can say for certain, and I would not ask you to believe it. What is certain is only this: the city hanged its deacon in full public view, and whatever private hope he may have carried up onto that scaffold with him did not save him. I do not need to tell you what came of him after that. In fiction, you may already sense it. A respectable man of the day who becomes, without warning, something else entirely once the sun goes down, was a shape of story that outlived Brodie by almost exactly a century, when a writer born in this same city who had grown up hearing the tale as a boy gave that same shape a new name and a chemical excuse. I will not linger on the connection longer than that. It is enough for tonight to know that the double life came first, and it was real, and it walked these same streets wearing an entirely convincing coat of respectability over the other one underneath. The building he was hanged in front of no longer exists at all, and that feels like the right place to close his chapter. The old toll booth stood for centuries beside the great church on the high street, serving Edinburgh at various times as its council chamber, its courthouse, and, increasingly as the centuries wore on, its prison and the place where the city carried out its executions, Brodie's among the last of them. By the early 1800s, the building was old, cramped, and considered a disgrace to the street it stood on. And in 1817 it was finally pulled down, and its prisoners moved to a new jail built on Calton Hill. For decades afterward, nothing at all marked where its door had stood. Then, in 1860, a heart shape, picked out in pale granite sets, was laid into the pavement on that exact spot, and it remains there today. A small mosaic heart in the middle of a busy square, walked over by thousands of people a day who mostly do not know, and have no particular reason to know, that they are crossing the threshold of a building where the city once hanged its own deacon, and before and after him a great many others besides. One writer who watched the old building come down cared enough to keep its actual door and built it into the wall of his own house, out in the borders where it still hangs, a solid piece of a vanished building bolted into a life that had nothing to do with it. The rest of the toll booth simply went, the way so much of this city's old fabric has gone, replaced first by empty ground and then, in time, by nothing more than a mark in the stone and a habit, if you are told the story, of glancing down as you cross it. Rest now on that thought a while, if it is a restful one for you. Most people you pass tomorrow will be exactly who they appear to be. But the city has, at least once, proven that it does not always tell, and it has more than once proven that it can make an entire building vanish and leave behind only a shape in the ground for those who think to look down. The fire wants tending. Let us leave the deacon's second coat folded away and go to the last room of the record, where two men found that a body did not need a grave at all to be worth something, if no one troubled to ask where it came from. Before there was Burke and Hare's shortcut, there was the ordinary grinding fear that made the shortcut worth taking. By the early 1800s, Edinburgh's medical schools had made the city one of the great centers of anatomical teaching in Europe, and every student needed, at some point in his training, to work on a human body with his own hands. The law allowed the schools only the corpses of executed criminals, a supply that had never been large and grew smaller as public appetite for hanging slowly cooled. Against that thin legal trickle stood a demand that grew every year, and into the gap between them stepped the resurrection men, who dug up the newly buried under cover of night and sold what they found to the schools before dawn. The city did not take this quietly. Families who could afford it paid for mort safes, heavy iron cages or lids bolted directly over a fresh grave and left in place for the weeks it took a body to become worthless to an anatomist, then removed and used again on the next grave that needed them. Several can still be seen today, rusted into the ground. In the kirkyards of the city, grey fry ours among them, the very ground where we sat with the Couvu Nanterres earlier tonight. Parishes that could not afford individual cages built watch houses instead, small stone huts at the graveyard gate, and paid men to sit through the winter nights with a lamp and a gun, watching freshly dug earth for anyone who came to disturb it. Grief, in this particular decade, came with an unusual second duty attached to it, the duty of guarding your own dead from being stolen back out of the ground. Burke and Hare's innovation, if that grim word can be used here, was to skip the grave entirely. Neither man troubled himself with spades or watch houses, or the risk of a bullet in the dark. Between them, over the course of 1828, they killed 16 people in a lodging house in the West Port, most of them lodgers, the poor, the friendless, people whose sudden absence drew few questions in a crowded and transient part of the city, and sold each body, still warm, directly to an anatomist for dissection, no digging required, and no mort safe to defeat. It was, in the coldest possible sense, more efficient than robbing a grave, and efficiency here meant murder committed 16 times before anyone thought to ask why so many of the district's poor had simply stopped being seen. Most of the 16 have come down to us only as a number, because the record that survives them best is the tally, not the person. 3 did not. 3 were named in the indictment that finally brought Burke and Hare to trial, and I will give you their names, because a number is easy to sleep past and a name is not, and I think tonight they have earned the harder kind of listening. Mary Patterson was about 18, drawn into the lodging house from a tavern with the promise of more drink, and killed there. When her body reached the dissecting room, more than one student recognized her face because Edinburgh was smaller than its crowd suggested, and everyone, eventually, had seen everyone. James Wilson, known to the whole town as Daft Jamie, was a young man of 18 with a limp and a gentleness that made him a familiar, harmless figure on the streets, well-liked and well-known by sight to a great many people, which was precisely the danger. When his body arrived at the same dissecting room, several students knew him at once, by face and by the limp, and said so. The anatomist is said to have denied it could be anyone they knew, and to have moved quickly to alter and dissect the body before the recognition could spread any further. The last of the 3 was Margaret Docherty, an Irish woman lured into the lodging house on the last night of October that year, on nothing more than the false claim that Burke's own mother shared her surname and her country. She was the final murder, and the one whose discovery, by a lodging-house guest who found her body hidden beneath a bed, finally ended the whole trade. 3 names out of 16, and even those 3 survived mostly because the crowd that watched Burke hang wanted somebody to blame in a shape they could see. The other 13 have no such shape at all. I offer you what the record offers me, which is not very much, and I think that is part of the weight of it. A city can lose 13 of its poorest people almost without noticing, and only stop when the 14th, 15th, and 16th happen to be recognized by name. They were caught before a 17th. Hare gave evidence against his partner in exchange for his own life, in an echo of the same bargain that had ended Deacon Brodie's freedom 40 years before him, though what Hare traded away was far darker than anything Brodie's own accomplice had to confess. Burke was tried, convicted, and hanged before a large public crowd in the early weeks of 1829. Hare walked free from the court and out of the historical record almost entirely, which strikes most people, on first hearing it, as the wrong ending. I record it because it is the true one. What came after matters more than the hanging itself. The case and the public horror at it became one of the pressures that led Parliament to pass the Anatomy Act of 1832, a law that widened the lawful supply of bodies for teaching, chiefly through the unclaimed dead of workhouses and hospitals, so that the trade Burke and Hare had turned to murder no longer needed grave robbers, iron cages, or armed watchmen in the cold to sustain it. It is a strange kind of legacy, a change in the law bought in part with 16 lives that the law had failed to protect in the first place. I offer you no ghost for this room. 16 ordinary people killed quietly and sold for a fair price, while a whole city stood guard over its honest graves and never thought to guard its living, is already more than enough to carry into sleep, and I would rather you carried the true weight of it than a story lighter than the fact. 5 rooms, and 1 more left. If your eyes are heavy by now, that is exactly as it should be, and you need do nothing at all to keep listening except let them close. I will still be here either way. The fire does not mind an audience that has stopped watching it. That is rather the point of a fire, if you think about it. It was never meant to be watched closely. It was meant to be nearby, doing its slow work in the corner of the room, while the people it was warming got on with the business of resting. This last room is not a room at all. It is the largest buried thing in the whole city, and unlike everything else I have shown you tonight, it is not hidden underground by accident. This one, the city buried on purpose. If you walk today through Prince's Street Gardens, the long green valley that splits Edinburgh's old town from its new, you are walking on the floor of a loch that no longer exists. It was not a natural loch. In the 1460s, the king of the time ordered a burn in that valley dammed, flooding the hollow between the castle ridge and the land beyond it, to give the castle and the town a wide defensive moat on their northern side. The water that filled it came to be called the Loch, and it did exactly the job it was built for. No army crossed it. but a moat built for soldiers becomes, over the centuries, a town grows old around it, something far less noble. And the Loch's second career was as the place Edinburgh put everything it did not want to look at. It had no outlet and barely any flow, so it sat and stagnated, and every close and wind on the ridge above it drained its waste directly downhill into the water. It was never a source of drinking water, not once in its whole existence, and by the middle of the 1700s, the smell rising off it on a warm day was reportedly bad enough to be a matter of civic complaint at the highest level. Later still, in 1759, the gas rising from its bed was said to have been strong enough to be smelled up in the closes above, thick enough that people reported feeling lightheaded simply walking past. A city had built itself a beautiful ridge of tall stone housing, and directly beneath its windows kept a stagnant, reeking tank of its own refuse for the better part of 300 years. That alone would be enough to close this record on. It is not the whole of it. But before I give you the rest, I owe you one more correction, the third of the night, because the most famous story told about this loch is another of the invented ones, and you deserve the true one instead. The story you will hear on tours and in books and from people who mean no harm by it is that the Loch was where Edinburgh swam its witches, bound thumb to toe, thrown in, sink and be innocent, float and burn. It is a vivid picture, and the historians who actually study Scotland's witch trials will tell you plainly that it is not what happened here. The swimming of witches was never the Scottish way of it. Scotland's persecution was real, and it was vast. Several thousand people accused across those centuries, most of them women, and those found guilty died by the rope and the fire after trial, not by ordeal in a loch. The water test belongs to other countries and to later imaginations, and it has been draped over this loch by 300 years of retelling, because a black, stinking loch below a castle simply looks like the kind of place it ought to have happened. What the record actually gives this water is grim enough without it. From the 1560s, the Loch was the city's ducking pool, a punishment for what the age called offences against decency and order, and the record holds one day in 1624 when 11 women were put through it together. Drowning itself was used in Scotland within the law as a form of execution until the 1680s, when it was done away with. And for as long as the Loch existed, it received, quietly and without ceremony, the city's suicides and its unwanted dead, the people whose endings nobody wished to examine closely. The Loch did not need the witch story. What it truly held was crueler for being ordinary, punishment as public spectacle, and the water always there, always convenient at the bottom of everything. So this is what lay beneath the pleasant valley for 3 centuries. Not a beauty spot, a damned, stinking, gas-choked tank of the city's own filth, a ducking pool for its punished, and a quiet receiving ground for the dead the city preferred not to discuss. It could not last either in the end, though it took the city a long time to admit it. By the 1750s, the smell alone had turned the wealthier residents against it, and pressure grew to have it done away with. Draining began in stages, and by the early 1800s the engineers of the new age set about the work properly, running it off over the better part of a decade until the valley stood empty for the first time in 350 years. Where the water had been, the city then did something almost defiant in its gentleness. It planted gardens. The valley that had been a moat, then a sewer, then a place of ordeal, was turned quite deliberately into one of the most beautiful public gardens in Scotland, laid out with grass and trees and flower beds, and a railway was later laid along part of its floor as well, running trains through the very ground where once the punished were ducked and the unexamined dead were let sink. Nothing sits on the surface today to tell you any of this. You could walk the length of those gardens on a summer afternoon, among the roses and the tourists and the sound of the trains passing underneath, and feel nothing of what the ground once held. That, more than any of the rooms I have shown you tonight, may be the truest thing I can tell you about this city. It does not simply forget what it buries. It plants a garden over the top of it, and the garden, in its own way, is honest too. Something dreadful stood here, the garden seems to say, and now something gentle stands here instead, and both of those things are equally true, and the second does not erase the first so much as grow, quite peacefully, on top of it. That is where I will leave you. Not underground for once, but in the open air, above a valley that used to be water, looking at flowers that grow whether they know it or not, from a floor that held 3 centuries of everything the city above it wanted gone. That is the city beneath the city, as much of it as I care to read into one night. You do not need to hold on to any of it now. That was true when I told you at the start, and it is still true here at the end. Let the details slide off, one by one, the way they have been sliding off for the last hour, and keep only the shape of the thing, if you keep anything at all. The shape is simple. A city builds itself upward, and every time it does, it leaves something behind underneath, and it does not always go back for what it leaves. Nothing down there is supernatural. It did not need to be. A bridge with a cellar full of the poor, who came down out of the rain and stayed, and left no names behind them for me to give you, only the shape of the rooms they slept in. A street roofed over and left standing in the dark, plague struck first, and then quietly built over, and a myth about bricked-up doors that was never true, laid gently aside in favor of the truer, sadder thing that was. A graveyard that held the living before it held you, a document signed in hope, and a winter enclosure that answered that hope with a fence and a season of cold. A respectable man who wore an honest coat over a dishonest one, and was believed for 20 years in both, hanged at last on a spot you could walk across tomorrow without ever knowing your feet had crossed it. 2 men who noticed that a body was worth more than a day's honest wage, and 16 people, 3 of them named at least, who paid for that noticing, while the whole city, elsewhere, stood guard with iron and lamplight over graves it thought were the only thing worth protecting. And a whole loch wide enough to drown an army's crossing, buried on purpose over the better part of a decade, with a garden growing sweetly over the top of it now and trains running underneath the roses. None of it needed a ghost. I want to say that to you plainly one more time before I close the book, because it is the truest thing I know about this work. The dead do not have to walk for a city's history to keep you awake a little longer than you meant to stay. The truth on its own, told plainly and without embellishment, is usually enough. It was enough tonight. The record keeps all of it, every room, every name I could find, and everyone I could not. And the record does not raise its voice because it does not need to. What happened was enough. I do not know how much of this you will remember in the morning, and it does not much matter to me either way. That is not why I read to you. I read to you so that for 1 hour, somewhere between waking and not, you had a little company in the dark, and something true to hold instead of whatever your own mind might otherwise have offered you at this hour. That is the whole of the service I can offer, and I offer it gladly, and I will be here again the next time you need somewhere quiet to put your thoughts down for the night. Sleep now, if you have not already. I have written the night down, and the writing holds it, so you do not have to. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever, if that is what you need from it. The fire is low, the door is shut. Old Man Ember keeps the rest.